Welcome to Chapter 23. Let's see how breathing works. Breathing has two distinct parts. On the one hand, you have skeletal muscle that contracts to pull air in. And then it relaxes to let the air out. This you can consciously control. Think about it. You can decide to hold your breath. You can decide to take a deep breath. But most of the time, you have other things to think about than breathing. So you do have an autopilot in your medulla oblongata. The other aspect of breathing is the airways that the air flows through. All right, your trachea, your bronchi, the bronchioles. You can control the diameter of these. So you can see like this one is constricted and this one is dilated. So by controlling the diameter of these, you control how much air gets in and out with each breath. And these are controlled by smooth muscle. Okay, so if they are constricted, then you get less air with each breath. And if they are dilated, you can get more air with each breath. And since there's smooth muscle, remember smooth muscle is always involuntary. So these are controlled by the autonomic nervous system. And that's where we have our two divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic. And this control comes from the medulla oblongata. Okay, next we'll look at some more detail of how you pull that air in and out. Okay, remember with the heart, we talked about the pericardium, that sac around the heart, the double layer serous membrane. Well, you have that around the lungs also. So right here, this is lung tissue. This is your chest wall. And in between is your pleura. The pleura is the same structure as the pericardium you already learned about. It is a double layer serous membrane. So if we look at the layers, you have right here on the surface of your lung is the visceral layer. Then you have here, attached to the chest wall, is the parietal layer. And there is a space in between, And that space in between the layers is the cavity. And the cavity has serous fluid. So it lubricates as you breathe. Okay, so that's lining your lungs. Okay, now if we come down to these pictures, we're going to see how you pull the air in and out. And that pleura and its pleural cavity are very important in pulling the air in and out. So first we'll number these pictures. This is 1, 2, 3, 4. That's the order we're going to look at the pictures in. Then if we label some things, the blue here is the pleural cavity. So in each picture, the part we're really focusing on is the pleural cavity. Now remember also you use skeletal muscles to pull air in and out. So we're also going to be talking about the intercostal muscles that are here in the chest and the diaphragm that is here at the bottom of the lungs. Okay, in picture number 1, and I'll use blue for 1 and 2 and then pink for 3 and 4. In picture number 1, this is a picture just before you inhale. Okay, in this state, your muscles are relaxed, the diaphragm and the intercostals. So if the muscles are relaxed, that means that your diaphragm is up. It forms a dome when it's relaxed. And when your intercostals are relaxed, your chest is in. So everything's compact. Everything is smaller right now. Your chest is in, your diaphragm is up. This means that that pleural cavity is small. Okay, now let's go to picture 2. In picture 2, you inhale. Okay, when you inhale, your chest rises. So your intercostals contract and pull your chest out. At the same time, the diaphragm goes down. Notice here the diaphragm is flat. Okay, this makes your chest cavity bigger. Notice that the pleural cavity is bigger here. Compare the size of it here to the size of it here. So these two muscles contracting and pulling outward pulls the parietal pleura with them. So the parietal pleura is pulled out away from the lungs. This makes the cavity bigger. Now this cavity is an enclosed space, and if you make an enclosed space bigger, you create suction. And that suction pulls air in. Okay, and remember also in chapter 20 and in 21, we were talking about blood in the veins and lymph. This suction is also what's helping to pull blood back to your heart and pull lymph up to your shoulders. Okay, now we can go on to pictures 3 and 4. So in picture 3, You're in this little slight pause where you've inhaled and now you're about to exhale. So this is just before you exhale. So notice the muscles are contracted. We've got the cavity is large. And the lungs are full of air. Because you just finished inhaling. Now if we go to picture 4. So look at the cavity. Here's the cavity. Here's the cavity. In picture 4, we make the cavity small again. We do that by having the muscles relax and bring the parietal pleura back in. So the chest comes back in, the diaphragm goes back up. You're bringing that parietal pleura back in toward the lungs. And when you do that, the cavity gets smaller. And if you have an enclosed space and you make it smaller, you create pressure. And that pressure pushes the air out. So the main idea here is that your muscles are contracting and pulling the parietal pleura away from the lungs, which makes the cavity bigger, which creates suction and pulls air in. Then your muscles relax and they bring that parietal pleura back toward your lungs. That makes the cavity smaller, which creates pressure and pushes the air out. And that's how you inhale and exhale. Now let's look at how you control your breathing. We know that you can have voluntary control when you want to. Let's focus though on the medulla oblongata and that autopilot that you use most of the time. So you can see that right here is your medulla oblongata. So your medulla oblongata is controlling your breathing most of the time. Well, if it's going to control your breathing, it needs information. It has to have a way to decide what it should do with your breathing. So first, let's look at the information that your medulla oblongata uses to determine how much you should breathe. Okay, so the blue lines in this picture are the information. And we're actually going to start with this box right here as number 1. This box is your central chemoreceptor. And as we go through these, they should be very familiar to you. It's the exact same things that we used for blood pressure. Remember, medulla oblongata is regulating blood pressure. It's the same information, or at least some of it is. Here you have, in this pink part here, carbon dioxide in your blood. Well, cerebral spinal fluid is made from your blood. So whatever carbon dioxide is in your blood, the same amount ends up in your cerebral spinal fluid. And remember, carbon dioxide forms acid. So the carbon dioxide of your cerebral spinal fluid determines the pH of it. So if you don't remember this from chapter 3, you definitely need to go back and remember that. Whenever you mix carbon dioxide with water, you get carbonic acid. This dissociates to give you bicarbonate and hydrogen ion. And because we have a hydrogen ion, we have acid. And acid lowers your pH. So the relationship between carbon dioxide and pH is that the more carbon dioxide you have, the lower your pH. Okay, that's going to be very important. So our first piece of information is pH of cerebrospinal fluid. And this is detected by your central chemoreceptor. It's called central because it's right there in your brain. It's this part right here. Okay, number 2 is your peripheral chemoreceptors. So think back to chapter 20. We covered these already. They are right here in your carotid and here in your aorta. So these are number 2. And they detect the pH, carbon dioxide, and oxygen of your blood. Then the third one we have right up here is if you have any irritants, like something gets in your nose or gets in your throat and is going to make you sneeze or cough. If you remember back to chapter 13, learning about the brain and the medulla oblongata, it's in charge of coughing, sneezing, and gagging. So if you have an irritant and you're going to sneeze or cough, you have to first take a deep breath. Pay attention the next time you sneeze. Right before you sneeze, you take a deep breath. So you have to take a deep breath to sneeze or cough and clear your airway. The fourth one is here. This is baroreceptors in your lungs. Okay, think back to chapter 16. We talked about baroreceptors. Also in chapter 20, they detect stretch. They will let you know if you are taking too deep a breath and overstretch your lungs. Okay, so if they start signaling, then your medulla oblongata is going to ease back on the breathing. And the fifth one here is proprioceptors. In your muscles and joints. Okay, these you may recall we covered them before. They detect movement and body position. This is where if you close your eyes and touch your nose, you're using your proprioceptors. They're the ones that know where all your body parts are. They tell your medulla oblongata if you're resting or active. Okay, so that's the information. the blue lines here are all representing information that's going to your medulla oblongata. Now notice we have a couple of red lines. So let's look at those red lines and see what they're doing. So the red lines are the signals to your skeletal muscle, telling them to make you inhale and exhale. Okay, so you're basically either going to breathe more or breathe less. So let's match up breathing more or breathing less with our information here. So we can lump 1 and 2 together. Okay, and remember the relationship between carbon dioxide and pH. So if pH is too low, that means you have too much carbon dioxide. So you need to breathe more to get rid of it. Okay, then also, if carbon dioxide is too high, because you do have a carbon dioxide receptor there, then you will breathe more to get rid of it. Okay, with the oxygen, in a normal healthy person, you're not going to use the oxygen receptor. It's only used where there's lung disease, and we're going to talk about that later. So the oxygen receptor only responds to very low oxygen. And a healthy person, your oxygen wouldn't get low enough to set off that receptor. So we're going to wait and talk about it in a little bit. Okay, so the irritants, remember we said that you have to take a deep breath so that you can sneeze or cough to clear them. Okay, the baroreceptors, if you're overstretching your lungs, you want to breathe less. You don't want to overstretch your lungs and then tear them. And with the proprioceptors, so think back to chapter 3, use that information. If you are active, that means you're going to use more ATP. And every time you make ATP, you also make carbon dioxide. And if you're making more carbon dioxide, then you need to breathe more to get rid of it. So the main thing that you're doing here with like 1 and 2 and 5, these are all about homeostasis of carbon dioxide and pH. Keeping those things right. And remember with pH, you want to stay at 7.4. Okay, so now let's move on. And I said we would talk about that low oxygen situation. Okay, first of all, let's look at the healthy person. So here in the yellow, this is a healthy person. Okay, so this is the cycle we just talked about. you would have, if you had increased carbon dioxide in the blood and cerebral spinal fluid, that's going to stimulate your receptors, and you're going to increase your breathing, and that's going to remove the carbon dioxide, and you're going to go back to normal. So you're going to maintain homeostasis, because you're detecting that carbon dioxide, you're breathing more to remove it, and then you're back to normal. And although this picture doesn't show it, you're also detecting pH. That's very important. So just by monitoring your pH and your carbon dioxide, you can keep everything at homeostasis. Okay, the green one here shows a person who has disease. And this is especially emphysema. And you can see there they've got emphysema as kind of the main one here. If you have emphysema, you can't exhale effectively. Air becomes trapped in the lungs. Well, because you can't exhale effectively, this means that carbon dioxide becomes trapped in your blood. Okay, so then think about what happens to carbon dioxide level. If it's trapped in your blood, the level becomes high. So you have high carbon dioxide, which would also mean that you have low pH. And this is chronic, right? You can't exhale, you can't get that carbon dioxide out, it's just trapped, and you just always have high carbon dioxide and low pH. Okay, with this situation, think back about type 2 diabetes, how you wore out your receptors with the high insulin. The same thing happens. This wears out the receptors. If it's chronically high for the carbon dioxide and chronically low for the pH, those receptors are working so hard trying to tell your medulla oblongata, and eventually they just get worn out because they constantly have to work hard. So now they don't work anymore. So you can see here, you have high carbon dioxide, but you get no increase in respiration. So because these receptors are worn out, your CO2 and pH levels no longer stimulate your medulla oblongata to increase your breathing. So you're sitting here, you have high carbon dioxide and low pH, but you don't breathe more to fix it. Because you wore out the receptors. So that means the problem just gets worse. And while the problem with your carbon dioxide is getting worse, your oxygen levels are dropping. So notice here, marked decrease in oxygen levels. Well, now your oxygen can actually drop low enough that you stimulate those receptors that only respond to very low oxygen. So now you finally get a signal. You get some working receptors because remember, in a healthy person, you're not using those receptors. So you've gone your whole life until you got emphysema not using these receptors really. So they're all fresh and new yet. So they work just fine and they stimulate the breathing and you get increased breathing. Okay, but here's the catch. So this is called hypoxic drive. Hypoxic means low oxygen. So remember, those receptors only respond if your oxygen is very low. So hypoxic drive means that you rely on very low oxygen to stimulate breathing. And if your oxygen level gets too high, you'll stop breathing. So this is why if you have someone with emphysema and they have oxygen, you can't turn it up too high. If you turn it up and you give them too much oxygen, they'll actually stop breathing. So hypoxic drive, you're relying on keeping your oxygen very low in order to stimulate you to breathe. Okay, now we can look at the airway part. So that was controlling the skeletal muscles, making you inhale and exhale. Now let's look at the ANS and your airway diameter. So remember, this is going to be how much air you bring in and out with each breath. And it's also controlled by the medulla oblongata. And it uses the same information. So all the stuff we have back up here in blue, the information, you're going to use that same information. So we don't have to go through that again. Just review that blue part with the information you're using. Okay, so if we come down here, you have your two options, sympathetic and parasympathetic. So we know that this is parasympathetic and this one is sympathetic. Okay, so parasympathetic is going to be if your pH, so now think it through. With parasympathetic, that's your rest and digest, you're going to end up breathing less, which means you'll retain carbon dioxide and you'll lower your pH. So this is the one you use if pH is high. And if pH is high, that means carbon dioxide is low. Okay, so if your pH is high or your carbon dioxide is low, then you will have your vagus nerve will secrete acetylcholine onto your airways, and they will constrict. If they constrict, this means you will get less air moving in and out with each breath. So this means you will retain carbon dioxide. And if you retain carbon dioxide, then your CO2 goes up and your pH goes down. And this is what you do when you are resting. Okay, remember, we went over this back in chapter 3. When you're resting, you have low ATP production, which means you have low carbon dioxide production. Okay, and remember we talked about, if you think about your blood as a bucket, your cells make ATP, and when they do, they put carbon dioxide in. Then your lungs take carbon dioxide out, and they have to be equal. As long as the amount your lungs take out equals the amount your cells put in, your pH will stay at 7.4. So when you're resting, you're using parasympathetic to constrict the airways. That way you don't accidentally lose too much carbon dioxide and then upset your blood pH. Okay, sympathetic would be if pH is too low. If pH is too low, that means your carbon dioxide is high. So in this case, you would use norepinephrine, which would bind to beta receptors. And that is going to cause the smooth muscle to dilate or to relax, and your airways will dilate. So now you will get more air with each breath, and you will lose that carbon dioxide. So now your carbon dioxide will come down. You will reduce your carbon dioxide, which will raise your pH, and you will come back to homeostasis. And this is what you do when you are active. Because remember, that bucket again, when you're active, your cells make more ATP, which means you have more carbon dioxide going into the blood. So you need to dilate those airways so you can get more carbon dioxide out so that you can maintain homeostasis. Okay, then just like when we talked about the heart and blood pressure, there are drugs that manipulate your receptors. We have that here with your respiratory system. So the first one here is an EpiPen. So if you think about this, think about epi. The epi in EpiPen stands for epinephrine. So this is simulating your sympathetic. The same thing down here, this is a rescue inhaler. Okay, and it contains albuterol. Okay, both of these medicines work in the same way. They both mimic norepinephrine. So that is called being an agonist. They are both norepinephrine agonists. So they will both bind to the beta receptor. Now, back in we were talking about the heart, we talked about beta blockers, something that binds to the beta receptor and blocks it, prevents norepinephrine. But here, they're a norepinephrine mimic. So when they bind to the beta receptor, you get the same result as if norepinephrine were doing it. So they're not blocking, they're stimulating. Your body can't tell the difference between these medicines and its own norepinephrine. So it's like somebody copies the key to your house and then they can unlock the door. That's what's happening here. The EpiPen is used to treat an allergic reaction. If you have a really, really bad, severe allergic reaction, you'll go into anaphylactic shock. The airways start closing up. So an allergy can cause the airways to close. So you take the EpiPen and you mimic sympathetic. And we know that sympathetic makes the airways dilate. So when you use that EpiPen, you get that medicine that binds to the beta receptors in the airways, and they dilate, and then you can breathe again. And this is common, like peanut allergies are common, bee sting allergies, anything where somebody could have a severe reaction, and they carry an EpiPen. The rescue inhaler is used in asthma. So this mimics sympathetic in an asthma attack. Because in an asthma attack, the airways are closing up and it's hard to breathe. So you take the rescue inhaler, it goes in there, binds to those beta receptors, your body thinks it's norepinephrine, and then the airways open back up. So there's where we can use our knowledge of the neurotransmitters and the hormones and the receptors and make medicines to mimic the or to alter the physiology. Remember back in chapter 19 learning about the heart, and you learned about the two circuits, the pulmonary and the systemic? The pulmonary circuit is the right side of the heart. Sends deoxygenated blood to the lungs. The blood gets oxygen, then it goes to the left side of the heart. And it's pulmonary veins that carry that oxygenated blood to the left side of the heart. So right here and right here, we have pulmonary veins. Okay, then you also have the systemic circuit. It is the left side of the heart, sends oxygenated blood to the body. This is how you nourish your cells. Then that deoxygenated blood, after it gives the oxygen to your cells, comes back to the right side of the heart. So remember that whole figure 8 thing. So you have, here's the right side of your heart, right here, and it sends the blood up through the pulmonary trunk to the pulmonary arteries, through your lungs where it picks up oxygen, then through the pulmonary veins to the left side of the heart. Then the left side of the heart receives that oxygenated blood. It sends it up to the aorta, which branches into systemic arteries, which we learned those in chapter 20. You go through the systemic capillaries where you give oxygen to the cells. Down here also. Then the deoxygenated blood comes back through the vena cava into the right side of the heart. Now, also remember from chapter 19, we talked about coronary circulation. So here is that picture of those coronary arteries. Okay, remember these? They branch from the aorta and they take oxygenated blood to the heart. So even though the heart is full of blood, it's not being nourished by the blood that's inside of it to get pumped. You have these arteries on the surface of the heart that are nourishing it. And because they're delivering oxygenated blood to cells and they're branching off the aorta, this is part of the systemic circuit. Okay, now think about your lungs in the same way as the heart. There's all this pulmonary blood in your lungs. So we can see here your lungs are full of pulmonary blood. But this blood is there to pick up oxygen. So your lungs are full of pulmonary circuit blood. But this blood is there to pick up oxygen. It is not nourishing the lungs. So just like your heart is not nourished by the blood that's in it to be pumped, your lungs are not nourished by the blood that's in there to pick up oxygen. And your heart has coronary circulation, which is part of systemic, to nourish it. Well, the same thing happens with your lungs. You have what's called bronchial circulation. This is part of your systemic circuit. So if it's part of systemic, that means it is oxygenated blood that is there to nourish your lungs. And it gives oxygen to your lungs. So there's actually two sets of blood in your lungs. There's the blood that is part of the pulmonary circuit that is just there to get oxygen. And it is from the right side of the heart, and it will go through the pulmonary veins to the left side of the heart. Then you have the bronchial circulation. This is blood that is there to give oxygen to your lungs. This blood is from the left side of the heart, and it went through the aorta. We look at this picture, you can see here is that pulmonary artery, right here, pulmonary artery. This is what's part of the pulmonary circuit. It is coming from the right side of the heart. And see, this blood is full of carbon dioxide. It goes through the pulmonary capillaries. It gets oxygen. And now here it is in the pulmonary vein going to the left side of the heart. Okay, then that other set of blood is right here. Bronchial artery, and notice from the aorta. So this is oxygenated blood of the systemic circuit. It is there going to your lungs, and here you can see it gives oxygen to your lungs. And then, now normally, systemic circuit blood would go back to the right side of the heart through a vena cava. But notice this, instead, it jumps into that pulmonary vein. So this is kind of a little cheat. So right here, this blood should take a vena cava to the right atrium, because that's what systemic blood does after it has given oxygen. But instead, it does this little cheat, and it just goes into the pulmonary vein with the oxygenated blood to the left atrium. So if you follow the path of this blood, it would be in the aorta, so it's in the left ventricle. It's oxygenated, it gets pumped into the aorta, it goes into bronchial circulation, it comes down here to your bronchial artery through the bronchial capillaries, it gives oxygen to the blood, it gives oxygen to the lung cells, then it's deoxygenated systemic blood, and it goes into the pulmonary vein and back to the left atrium again. So it's kind of an odd little path there, but that is how you nourish your lungs. Now let's look at partial pressure and gas exchange. So we know that the atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. Okay, we talked about millimeters of mercury back when we covered blood pressure. It's the same idea. You have a tube with a bulb. There's mercury, Hg stands for mercury, and air pressure pushes on the bulb. This makes the mercury rise up in the tube, and then you just use a ruler and you measure how many millimeters it goes up. So the higher the air pressure, the more intense the air pressure, the further it pushes the mercury up that tube. So 760 is just an average. It actually varies. If you go up on top of a mountain, the number is lower. It also varies with the weather. So like on bright sunny days versus rainy days, you have differences in air pressure. But we're just going to use the average of 760. Okay. Then if we talk about partial pressure, air is a mixture of gases. Each gas contributes to that total pressure. So partial pressure is how much is contributed by one individual gas, and we can just abbreviate it pp. So if you look at this picture, we have gas number 1 here, the blue dots, and here is its pressure of 1. Here's gas number 2, the green dots, and it has a pressure of 2. And when you put them together, you get a pressure of 3. Okay, if we look at the air that you're breathing, the air you're breathing is mostly made of nitrogen, oxygen, water vapor, and carbon dioxide. Nitrogen is the biggest part of air. Nitrogen is 78.6% of the air you're breathing. Oxygen is next. Oxygen is 20.9%. Water vapor is 0.46%, and carbon dioxide is 0.04%. So that is the air you're breathing. If we take those percentages and make them into partial pressure, so we know that total pressure is 760. So then we just want to know the partial pressure of each. Well, all you do is multiply. If we know the total pressure is 760, and we know that nitrogen is 78.6% of that, we just take 78.6% of 760, and that comes out to 597. If we take 20.9% of 760, we get that oxygen has a partial pressure of 159. Water vapor is 3.5, and carbon dioxide is 0.3. So now notice this column says atmosphere. So this is the air you breathe. This is what is in the room around you. The next column is alveoli. This is the air in your lungs. Okay, so the air you breathe and the air in your lungs is actually a little bit different from each other. We're only going to worry about oxygen and carbon dioxide here because those are the gases you're exchanging. The partial pressure of oxygen for the air in your lungs is 104, and for carbon dioxide is 40. So I want to explain the difference in these numbers. If you just going to focus on oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay, the air that's right in front of your face right now has a partial pressure of 159 for oxygen and 0.3 for carbon dioxide. You take a breath in. Now that air is in your lungs, and that very same air suddenly changes to 104 and 40. The reason for that is you never completely empty your lungs. When you take a breath in, so you have air comes in, goes down all the way down here until your alveoli. Then you exhale, and that air starts going back out. Not all of it makes it out. You always have residual volume. So this is the air that is still in your lungs and your airways after you exhale. Okay, think about drinking from a straw. You're at the movies, you have your drink, and there's that last little bit of soda you can never quite get out, right? Also, if you think about when you drink through the straw, you go to take a sip, the soda starts moving up the straw. You have some that gets up here into the straw, and then you stop drinking. Well, this stuff falls back down into your cup. That's how your lungs are. For one thing, you always have some air in your lungs. You can never completely empty your lungs. For another thing, when you exhale, there's going to be some air that, say, makes it to this point. And then you stop exhaling and you start inhaling again. Well, the air right there at that point then gets sucked back in. Think of it like a bathtub. Say you have your bath water. Then you start to drain the tub. But before the tub is completely empty, you plug it up and refill it. Now, your next bath is a mixture of the old water and the fresh water. That's what happens when you breathe. This is the fresh water or the fresh air you breathe in. But then it gets in your lungs and it mixes with the old air from your last breath. So that is why the oxygen in your lungs is lower than the oxygen in the air, and the carbon dioxide in your lungs is higher than the carbon dioxide in the air. With every breath, you mix fresh air with old air. And so this reduces the oxygen and raises the carbon dioxide. So now we know that in your lungs we have 104 for oxygen and 40 for carbon dioxide. Now let's see what goes on with the gas exchange. So in this picture, this part is the air. And this is the blood. Okay, so we know that oxygen is 104, and we know that carbon dioxide is 40. Okay, now notice the direction of blood flow. Here's our arrow. Blood is flowing this way. So on the left, we have the old deoxygenated blood from the body. The level of oxygen is 40. So this is blood that has already given oxygen to the cells. So its oxygen level is down to a partial pressure of 40. Now also, when you give oxygen to cells, you pick up carbon dioxide. So we have 45 for carbon dioxide. Now we do diffusion. So think back to chapter 4. Oxygen and carbon dioxide move by diffusion. So you're going to move high to low until equal. Okay, so oxygen is 104 in the air. It's 40 in your blood. You're going to move high to low. So here you can see the oxygen arrow. Oxygen is going to move from the air into your blood. Now, here's the part you have to think about. Let's say there's an oxygen molecule right here, and it moves into your blood. Well, that leaves an empty space here when it moves. You're not just going to leave that space empty. The next oxygen that was right here will move up to take its space. So now you have an empty space there. So then the next one right here moves up to take its space. And the next one moves up to take its space. You just keep having them move up to take each other's spaces. See here in his face? Here that is. Follow this arrow. It's going through his nose all the way down like this. Each oxygen just keeps moving up to take the other space. So that means that you start with 104. One of them moves into the blood. You would be down to 103 now. But instead, each one keeps moving up to take the place of the one before it. So the 104 never actually drops it just stays 104. So we're going to have oxygen move into the blood. But the amount of oxygen in the lung stays consistent because it just keeps moving in to take the place. Now, if you were to close your mouth and plug your nose, then this wouldn't happen and the amount of oxygen would actually drop. But as long as you have that open airway all the way down like this, each one is just going to keep moving in to take the place of the other. So if the 104 never drops and diffusion goes until we're equal, that means we're going to equalize at 104. So the blood here, after it has exchanged with your lung, is 104. The same idea happens with carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is going to move this way. So we have 40 carbon dioxides. One comes in. Well, this one that comes in has to bump the guy ahead of him. So he bumps him up, and that bumps the guy ahead of him, and bumps him up, which bumps the one ahead of him. And they just keep bumping each other up all the way out your nose. So if you look here, see there's that arrow? Now let's look at what happens once you get out to the cells. In this picture, we have your cells. So this is systemic. And here is the direction of blood flow. It's going this way. So where we left off here, this blood comes down here. Now, one thing that is going to be different is the oxygen here is 95 instead of 104. So we have something to figure out. You have blood up here leaving the lungs and going to the left side of the heart at 104. But then when it arrives at your cells, it is 95. So what happened in between is that bronchial circulation. Remember this picture we looked at before? You have the systemic bronchial circulation. This is the blood that gives oxygen to your lung cells. Here we have the pulmonary circulation. So this is that pulmonary blood in your pulmonary vein that has just picked up oxygen. This is where we have 104. But because it mixes with this pulmonary blood right here that has just given, or I'm sorry, the systemic blood right here that has just given blood to your lung cells, it switches to 95. You dilute that oxygen down. Okay, so back to here. Your carbon dioxide is 40 because it's the blood leaving the lungs coming out here. Now we're going to exchange with the cells. In your cells, the oxygen level is 40 and the carbon dioxide level is 45. This is a constant. your cells stay at 40 for oxygen and 45 for the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. This is because making ATP is constant. So you're going to give oxygen to your cells. So oxygen is going to go this way. And remember, it's going to diffuse until it's equal, but it's going to equal out at 40. That is because as you give oxygen to your cells, they use it. It's kind of like giving a dog a treat. If I give my dog one treat, he eats one. If I give him 5 treats, he eats 5. However much oxygen you give your cells, they use. The carbon dioxide is going to move into the blood because it's going to diffuse high to low. But we're going to equal out at 45. That's because cells make carbon dioxide at the same rate you remove it. So we're giving the cells oxygen, we're picking up their carbon dioxide, but the numbers in the cells don't change, only the blood changes. Now we're ready to repeat. So then this is the blood that goes to the right side of the heart, which pumps it to the lungs, and there we are, back to the 40 and 45 that we started with in the lungs. So that is how the gas exchange occurs between, you have external respiration, is the one up here. That's between your blood and the air in your lungs. And this is internal respiration between your cells and the blood. Now let's look at some more details at how those gases travel in the blood. So we just went over the gas exchange between the blood in the lungs and the blood in the cells. Now we're going to see what those gases do while they're in the blood. We'll look at carbon dioxide first. Carbon dioxide has 3 methods of travel in the blood. The first one is the majority of carbon dioxide. 70% of the carbon dioxide in your blood does that reaction that we've talked about before. It mixes with the water in your blood and it forms carbonic acid. This then dissociates and you get bicarbonate and hydrogen ion. And because you end with a hydrogen ion, you decrease your pH. The second way carbon dioxide travels in your blood is 23% of the carbon dioxide enters a red blood cell. And if you remember back to chapter 18 when we talked about hemoglobin, we said that carbon dioxide binds to the globin part of it. So that's what 23% of the carbon dioxide does. Then the remaining 7% just dissolves in the plasma in your blood. It doesn't bind to anything, it doesn't react with anything, it just hangs out in the blood plasma. Then if we look at oxygen, oxygen has 2 ways it travels in the blood. Oxygen has a low solubility. This means that it does not like to mix with water. And we know that blood is mostly water. So 98% of the oxygen in your blood is in your hemoglobin. And it binds to the iron in hemoglobin. The other 2% will dissolve in plasma. So it's a low solubility, which means it doesn't like to dissolve in water, but it's not no solubility. So you do have 2% mixes with the water, but the other 98% rides on the hemoglobin. Then I want to explain what oxygen saturation is. So this is a common measurement that's taken. And we have those little meters in class that you've put on your finger before and you've seen your oxygen saturation. This is telling us what percentage of hemoglobins are carrying an oxygen. And this is in arterial blood. Okay, normal is 98%. Let's think of hemoglobin like a train. You have a train with 100 cars. This train flows through your lungs. As it does, you load oxygen cargo onto the train. In a normal person, you will get oxygen onto 98 of the cars. And 2 of the cars will slip by you without getting any oxygen onto them. This would be a 98% O2 saturation. %98 of your hemoglobins are carrying oxygen in your arterial blood. This is what is being taken out to your cells. Once that blood gets out to your cells, you give the oxygen to your cells. So this blood goes through your systemic capillaries. And it gives oxygen to your cells. Now, it doesn't give all of the oxygen to your cells. Once the blood has gone through the capillary and it's heading back to the heart, so now we have the venous blood. After the capillary is still typically about 70% saturated. So that means that you have 100 train cars, you have 98 of them have oxygen, You go through the capillary, and as you do, you'll say that 28 give their oxygen to a cell. Now you have your venous blood, where 70 still have their oxygen. So that's what's happening in a normal, healthy adult at rest. But when you exercise or you have a fever or something else going on in your body, you need more oxygen. So this 70 that you still have is called your oxygen reserve. You never want to just give away all of the oxygen and have your blood be empty of oxygen. You always keep a cushion or a backup. So the oxygen reserve is that 70% oxygen saturation in your veins. You can use some of that when you need it. So this picture is showing how you get that oxygen reserve. So getting the oxygen reserve would be that more of the hemoglobins give oxygen to your cells. So you're going to get more oxygen going to your cells, and it means that you're going to have a lower venous O2 saturation. So maybe instead of 28 of the cars giving their oxygen to the cells, maybe it'll be 38. There's three main ways that the body can induce the hemoglobins to give up more oxygen. And remember, this tends to happen when you're active. Because when you're active, you need more ATP, which means you need more oxygen. Okay, the first one, think about the second law of thermodynamics. If you forgot that, look back at page 73 in your book. When you exercise, you produce heat. And that heat stimulates more of the hemoglobins to let go of their oxygen. The next two we can lump together. Active cells make more waste. And that waste products stimulates the hemoglobin to release oxygen. The third one is carbon dioxide. Active cells make more carbon dioxide. And remember, 23% of your carbon dioxide binds to the globin. So right here is the globin. That's where you would have carbon dioxide. So if it's always going to be 23% that binds the globin, if you make more carbon dioxide, more of it will bind the globin. And this has the effect of kicking the oxygen out. Hemoglobin can hold either oxygen or carbon dioxide, but not both at the same time. So if carbon dioxide goes in, oxygen gets kicked out. Okay, so there is the oxygen and carbon dioxide, mainly the oxygen, in your blood as it's leaving your lungs and as it's leaving your cells, and how your cells can get more oxygen when they need it. Let's think a little more about this idea of oxygen saturation. I said that 98% is normal. If you wanted to get 100%, you would have to lock yourself in a hyperbaric chamber. The level of oxygen saturation in your blood is controlled by air pressure. This 98% is normal. That is at sea level. Okay, as you go up, like if you were to go up in a mountain, there's less oxygen. So at high altitude, there is less oxygen. The air is thin. And so if you go up at high altitude, you will have a lower oxygen saturation. This is why people get altitude sickness. If you go hiking in the mountains and your body's not used to it, if you're just there on vacation, you can get altitude sickness. Here's a chart that shows the percent oxygen saturation at different partial pressures of oxygen. So we start off here is sea level. As you go up in altitude, the partial pressure of oxygen goes down, and so your blood oxygen saturation would go down. Say you're somewhere where the partial pressure of oxygen is only 60 instead of 105, you would only be able to obtain a 90% O2 saturation. So the main idea here is that air pressure controls your oxygen saturation. At sea level, 98% is normal. If you wanted to get 100%, you would have to go into a hyperbaric chamber. And you would have to triple the air pressure. Then if we think about carbon dioxide, the level of carbon dioxide is controlled by how much you breathe. So this is what we were talking about before with your medulla oblongata controls your breathing rate and depth. And you have your autonomic nervous system. You can dilate or constrict your airways. So these things, your rate and depth of breathing and the diameter of your airways, this controls your carbon dioxide level. This is why you breathe slow and shallow when you're resting, why you breathe deep and heavy and dilate your airways when you're active. Okay, so let's look at a scenario. We have Sheldon here, and Sheldon is hyperventilating. This means he is breathing too much. He's breathing too much. He is losing more carbon dioxide than his cells are making. This means he has hypocapnia, which means low blood carbon dioxide. So if his blood carbon dioxide is low, that means his pH is too high. So the paper bag helps with this. The paper bag will trap that CO2 that you are losing. And then it will allow you to inhale it back in. And this will then stabilize your carbon dioxide and pH. So the main idea here is that air pressure controls your oxygen level, and how much you breathe controls your carbon dioxide level.